Hello. I'm Sally, your host. Welcome to my Master's Chess channel, the third board. In this video, I will show you the conclusion of the game played between the second world champion, Emanuel Lasker, and the German master, Richard Teichmann, in 1904, Cambridge Springs. If you have not watched part 1, I recommend you watch it first. Just click the link above. If your device does not show the link, you can access part 1 through links my master made available in this video description and in the comments section. So, let's continue the game. As we watched in the last video, in this position, Richard Teichmann had black and played bishop takes bishop, allowing Emanuel Lasker to invade black's position with his rook. The game continues with rook takes on e7, bishop to a6. If black retreated the bishop to c6, it would be followed by pawn to d5, bishop to e8, h3, knight to f6, rook takes on c7, and white would be better. Let's return to the game. After bishop to a6, white continues with rook takes on c7, knight takes on f2. Black retakes material, but a better move was rook from a to e8 according to Stockfish. White continues with rook to e1, occupying the king's file, and aiming to double rooks on the 7th rank. But according to the engine, it was better to play rook to d2. Black continues with rook from f to e8, rook from e to e7, rook takes on e7, rook takes rook. Now, look carefully at this position. White has two threats here. Rook to d7 and knight to g5. Which one would you address? In this position, Teichmann plays rook to d8, preventing rook to d7. However, according to the engine, he committed a mistake. Instead of rook to d8, it was better to play king to f8. The game could have continued like this: rook to d7, rook to e8, b3, knight to g4, knight to g5, f6, knight from g to e4, rook to e7, rook takes on d6, bishop to f1, rook to d8 check, rook to e8, rook takes rook check, king takes rook, g3, knight takes on h2, and the position would be equal. Let's return to the beginning of this variation. After black's rook to e8, if white plays rook takes on d6, we could have bishop to f1, knight to h4, knight to g4, rook to d7, knight takes on h2, and the position would be equal. Let's return to the original position. After rook to d8, Lasker continues with knight to g5, threatening the f7 pawn. If black avoids it with f6, he will allow this white knight to go to the e6 square, where it will become a monster, attacking the rook and the g7 pawn. Teichmann cannot allow that. He plays knight to g4, allowing f7 to fall. White continues with h3. Lasker does not take the f7 pawn right now. And this was a mistake according to Stockfish. If he took the pawn with the knight, the game could have continued like this. King to f8. Rook to c7. Rook to e8. Knight takes on d6. Rook to e6. Rook to c8 check. King to e7. Knight takes on b7. And white would be much better. If white took the pawn with the rook, however, it would be a mistake. The game could have continued with pawn to h6. Rook to f4. Knight to f6. Knight from g to e4. And white would be a pawn up, but in Stockfish evaluation, his advantage would be greatly reduced. However, after h3, the knight retreats to f6, and the variation we just studied before would not work. For example, knight takes on f7. King to f8. Rook to c7. Knight to e8. And after that, rooks would be exchanged, and the resulting position would be equal. Apparently, Lasker lost a good opportunity to convert his advantage, but still, he has a better position. Let's return to the game. Teichmann continues with knight to f6. b4. Bishop to f1. Rook takes on b7. Rook to a8. Here, Teichmann lost an opportunity to reduce Lasker's advantage. Instead of rook to a8, it was better to play pawn to a5. The game could have continued like this. Knight takes on f7. Rook to f8. Knight takes on d6. Bishop takes on g2. Threatening the rook, and the h3 pawn. Here, the best option for white is to sacrifice the exchange by playing pawn takes pawn. And after that, bishop takes rook. Knight takes bishop. And white would be better, but not by much according to the engine. Let's return to the beginning of this variation. If white does not sacrifice the exchange and plays something like rook to b6, the game could continue this way. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn to a4. Pawn to h5. And the position would be equal according to the wise fish. Let's return to the game. After rook to a8, we may have arrived at the most interesting, and perhaps most difficult position of the game. The black bishop is threatening the g2 pawn, and if it is taken, the h3 would be in a precarious situation. I chose 3 candidate moves for white here. They are: knight takes on f7, pawn to g4, and pawn to g3. Which one is the best for white? If you wish to try to find the best move, pause the video now. If white plays knight takes on f7, the game could continue like this. Bishop takes on g2. Rook to e7. It is difficult to keep this rook on the 7th rank, so this rook is going back to e2, where it will attack the bishop. King to f8. Rook to e2. Bishop takes on h3. Knight takes on d6. Rook to d8. Knight from d to e4. Rook takes on d4. Knight takes on f6. Pawn takes knight. White would lose all his pawns on the king side, and the position would be equal. If white plays g4, the game could continue like this. h6. Knight takes on f7. Bishop to g2. Rook to e7. King to f8. Rook to e2. Bishop takes on h3. Knight takes on d6. Bishop takes on g4. Rook to f2. White would be slightly better despite having lost all his pawns on the king side. As you noticed, in both cases white loses his pawns on the king side, decimated by the black bishop. And after that, the black king side pawns will be free to advance. Lasker's next move will save at least one pawn, necessary to stop the advance of those black pawns. In this position Lasker plays g3. Teichmann continues with bishop to g2. Rook to e7. Rook to c8. Knight to d5 was better. Knight to b5. Knight to d5. Rook to e2. With this move, Lasker initiates a maneuver that will simplify the game, and give him 2 connected passed pawns. He is not worried about bishop to f1, as you will see soon. Black continues with bishop to f1. Knight takes on d6. Bishop takes on e2. Knight takes on c8. Knight takes on b4. White has 2 connected passed pawns now. a3. Knight to d5. Knight to d6. Although this is a good move, an alternative was knight takes on a7. In this case, the game could have continued like this. Bishop to f1. King to d2. Bishop to g2. c4. h6. Knight takes on f7. King takes on f7. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes on h3. And here, like in the game, white would be better. It is mystery for me why Lasker did not choose this variation. Perhaps he thought his two connected passed pawns were enough to win, and wanted to avoid complications. Let's return to the game. After knight to d6, black continues with f6, knight to e6, bishop to f1, h4, bishop to h3, knight to f4, knight takes on f4, g takes on f4. And here we arrived at another interesting position of the game. Be patient. This is the last quiz. Observe carefully this position. Black has a majority of pawns on the king side, and an active bishop. White's advantage has diminished after the exchange of knights, and the creation of isolated pawns on the king side. Still, with two connected passed pawns, white is better. In this position, Teichmann has a last opportunity to create complications, and perhaps save the game. What would you play here if you are black? If you wish to try to find the best move, pause the video now. Here the best move for black is pawn to g5. In order to create a passed pawn on the king side. The game could continue like this. F takes on g5. Pawn takes pawn. H takes on g5. King to g7. King to d2. King to g6. King to e3. King takes on g5. And black has his passed pawn. c4. h5. d5. King to f6. King to f4. h4. Knight to e4 check. King to e7. King to f3. Bishop to f5. c5. h3. Knight to d6. Bishop to d3. And, the game could be marching for a draw. Let's return to the game. In this position, Teichmann plays King to f8. Lasker continues with King to d2. King to e7. Knight to e4. King to e6. c4. And, in this position, Richard Teichmann resigned. Did you like this game? It was our longest video so far, but a very instructive one. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want notifications of more content like this, please subscribe to this channel. My master and I wish good luck in your chess. Thank you, and see you again. Goodbye.